I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Folks, there's a problem with being a full-time reviewer. Cue me whining about how hard it is to be a full-time reviewer. No. The problem with being a full-time reviewer is that when you see so much stuff day in and day out, on some level, it all just kind of blends together, and you're like, okay, great, another motor, another camera, another frame, and it can be a little bit hard to get excited about anything. But not today. Today we are looking at the Hyperlow Vert Free V2. This frame is pretty freaking slick, and I'm pretty freaking excited to show it to you. One of the questions that always comes up when we talk about quadcopter frames is what distinguishes a racing frame from a freestyle frame? And to me, one of the big things has been the balance between maintainability and durability and flight performance. Racing frames skew hard towards pure flight performance. They are as light as possible. They're as durable as they need to be without adding additional weight, and they're often really freaking difficult to build. I have a smooth operator that I fly every now and then, but every time I burn an ESC or something, I just want to beat myself over the head with something blunt because working on it is such a pain. So when we look here at the Hyperlow Vert Free V2, it's really interesting to see where this designer has made the choices about the balance between maintainability, durability, and flight performance, because you can obviously see where the priority was flight performance. This is an ultra slammed deck, and that gives centralized center of gravity, centralized center of mass. The more centralized your center of mass is, the more neutral your quad is going to be, the easier it's going to be to rotate and accelerate, the less you're going to have to work to tune out, bounce back on snappy pitch flips and rolls, and just overall the better the quad will fly. But the Vert Free, is it the Free V2? Is it the Vert Free? I don't know how to refer to this quadcopter. Let's just call it the Vert. The Vert doesn't completely skew towards performance. It does have some nods to maintainability. So when we take out these 4 screws on the underside, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we loosen these screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, these guys move out of the way, this plate lifts off, and we have full access to all of the electronics. And this is similar to what the Catalyst Machineworks Smooth Operator tried to do, but the Smooth Operator didn't do as good a job of it as giving you just full access to all the electronics. It's just a little bit of a tighter frame. The other thing about the Smooth Operator that drives me crazy is that in order to get at the front stack, the ESC, the whole front end has to fall apart, whereas the Vert here gives you access to all the electronics without actually having to remove any of the structural screws. Way to go. Very nice choice, Hyperlow. Now, it's a little hard to show you this on camera, but here's another nice touch. The Hyperlow Vert has these mounting plates for your receiver and your video transmitter or whatever else you might put on here. In this case, they've been provided as TPU prints, and they go between the stack screws and this other set of screws back here that's a little hard for me to show you. Gives you something nice to strap that to and hold it in place, but it also gives you room so that you don't have to strap your electronics to the top or bottom plate. And that's always been something that bugged me. On top mount quads, I never mount any electronics to the top plate because, number one, I want to be able to remove the top plate without anything getting in the way for maintenance. And number two, I don't want the battery strap pulling on or tugging on. The battery takes a big shock in crashes. I don't want it messing up my electronics. So this lets you mount all your electronics in a convenient location, a secure location. You don't have to worry about electrical conductivity because this is plastic, and you have plenty of room between the plates for your battery strap or whatever else you might want to do. And now, speaking of battery straps, I love what has been done here with this plate for the battery strap. And this is something a lot of manufacturers would have decided not to do because it adds weight, but there's so many times when I break a battery strap in the field and it's so annoying practically having to pull the whole frame apart just to run a new battery strap. This plate specifically gives, it's just for battery strap to go through here. Easy to run a spare and not interfering or rubbing up against or messing up any of your electronics here on the inside. I really adore that they've done this. And this is a place where this frame skews a little bit away from performance and towards usability. And this is the kind of thing that to me makes it stand out as a freestyle frame. This is my absolute favorite way of mounting a video transmitter antenna, just with 2 zip ties here and it coming straight out the back. It gives it good durability. It lets it move just a little bit in a crash, but not so much that it's going to just snap right off. Secures the SMA connector. Just a fantastic way of mounting the antenna. The only downside of this method, as seen here, is that with the SMA connector touching the carbon, in some cases that's going to create additional video noise. And if they've been smart, they are smart. Yeah, so good for them. They've actually got a TPU pad right here to gives a little bit more security in holding it tight against, gives it something to sort of compress into and hold it in place, but also prevents that SMA connector from touching the carbon and electrically isolates it for the cleanest video possible. Very nice touch. Now, the way that the arms have been configured, to me, is a little bit controversial because, first of all, let's just acknowledge that this triangular truss-based construction does give a lot of stiffness for very little weight. But the flip side is that other frames I've flown with this similar design, if this front piece takes a good solid whack on a steel I-beam where you're flying around a bando, boom, it's gone. These are essentially consumable. Whereas if we compare that to something like this is the Armatan Chameleon TI, these arms can take an enormous amount of stress without actually breaking. Eventually, they do break. You hit anything enough times, it'll break. But my point is that with a design like this, I would expect that one solid hit would break this. Just you're going to get unlucky and it's going to happen. Whereas with the thicker arms of more traditional freestyle frames, you're going to be able to take a few hits before they actually give out and go. The flip side is, though, that these thin vertical arms are going to give a lot more of the thrust that the prop makes. They're going to let that go into moving the quad. The wider arms of a more traditional freestyle frame block the thrust column and you lose some energy there. If we actually measure the width of these arms, I wonder proportionally how much we've saved. Let's find out. 5 millimeters, 5.1, and this guy is 5 millimeters as well. So we've got a total of 10 millimeters. Whereas if we compare that to something like the Chameleon, we've got 20 millimeters. So we've got literally half as much carbon blocking the thrust column for the Hyperlow as we do on something like the Chameleon. And that does make a difference you can feel when you fly. The Vert places the rear arms above this separator and the front arms below the separator. And the reason for that is that by raising the rear arms vertically above the front arms, it gives the rear props just a little bit more clean air and gets just a little bit more efficiency out of the rear motors. If you think about the way the quadcopter is flying forward, it's flying this way, the front props encounter clean air with no turbulence in it or anything. The front props churn up the air, and that turbulent air then goes into the rear props, which means the rear props have to work harder to make the same amount of thrust. And if you look in black box logs of a quad flying forward, you'll see that the rear props are typically spinning faster than the front props. And people think, oh, that's because of the CG, but it's not. It's an aerodynamic effect. By raising the rear props, and in this case, they're raised just a little bit, but by raising the rear props, you get just a little bit more efficiency out of them. Actually, this is exactly how the Catalyst Machineworks Smooth Operator does it, and when I saw it, it kind of got me wondering who did it first. And then I slapped myself in the face and I realized that two independent designers can come up with a similar idea to solve the same problem without one of them having copied the other. Stop worrying about cloning quite so much, people. It's not a big deal. This is a great solution to the problem, and they probably both just came up with it completely independently, or they probably both just copied some third guy we've never heard of. Sorry, third guy. I know you're out there not getting credit for this invention. I don't know who you are, though. Okay. As far as the camera goes, this to me is one of the weakest parts of the design. I feel like a freestyle frame should have very good protection for the front end because the front end is where a lot of the hard impacts are going to go. And your freestyle camera is going to take those impacts and get destroyed. That's probably the number one, next to motors. The FPV camera is probably the number one thing that gets destroyed on a freestyle quad. Now, one of the things that the Hyperlow tries to do is add in this little chin here. And I saw this first, I first noticed this on Paul Nurkola's frame where he puts a little chin on there to try and help protect it. But the problem is that when you are flying forward, really the GoPro is going to take a hit in forward flight before the freaking camera does. I don't know if that's probably not any better, to be honest with you. It's kind of leading with the GoPro, isn't it? Yeah, maybe we should set the GoPro back just a little bit so it doesn't. But then what's going to take the hit? Ideally, you want something really strong, like on the Chameleon TI, the titanium front end takes the hit. Or in a case of something like this, you could have carbon fiber take the hit, but that's just not going to happen. If you look at the frame when it's sitting flat, you think, it's hard to show you guys because of the motors, but you think that this carbon piece is going to help protect the camera because it extends out. And maybe in some impacts it will, but in a typical flight scenario, the quad's going to be pitched forward to the point that the camera is just almost completely unprotected except by the GoPro, which is hardly ideal. So if there were one thing I would change about this frame, it would be to find some way to redesign the front end so that the FPV camera was better protected and so that the GoPro was not sort of leading. I think maybe the reason they've moved it forward is to help keep the props out of view, but if you do that at the expense of smashing your GoPro, maybe that's not ideal. Just for perspective, if we compare this to something like the Chameleon TI completely protects the FPV camera, and the GoPro doesn't extend significantly farther. It can still take a hit, don't get me wrong. I mean, nothing's going to protect it completely, but in a straight front-on crash, it's more, well, you can see the difference. You decide. It doesn't appear to actually be raining at this exact minute. That sound is all just rain falling from the trees. So I'm going to try and get a flight in for you guys. Let's just hope I don't crash. Oh my God. Oh, it's so wet. Oh, it's so wet. Please unplug, 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 unplug. Unplug, unplug, unplug. Oh, okay. Okay. I was tempted to try to fly it home, but it's so wet. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that flight. I was a little cowardly because I didn't want to crash in the wet grass and dirt and mud and destroy this quadcopter. So I didn't absolutely rip balls, but you could hopefully see a little bit how it flies. I gotta tell you guys, how does it fly? I don't know. It flies like a quadcopter. The PID controller really dominates, in my opinion. It flies like a Betaflight 4.0 quad, not like a stretch decks. If you really dig into the minutiae of the tuning, you're going to see some differences on the pitch axis versus the roll axis because of the geometry, but mostly it flies like Betaflight 4.0. And so there you go. But there's some flight footage because, you know, of course you can't review a frame without putting some flight footage in it. What can we say about this frame in closing? And to do that, I want to go back to where we started with the trade-off between ease of maintenance, ease of use, durability, and flight performance. This frame definitely is more fiddly and more complicated than most freestyle frames. Just look at the sheer number of parts that go into it. Think about the number of parts that go into a frame like an Alien. You've got standoffs, you've got a top plate, a bottom plate. If you've got removable arms on that style of frame, then you've got separate arms. But basically, there just aren't that many parts to it. Compared to something like this, there are a lot more parts to put together. Just look at the stack here. You've got a nut, a spacer, a screw, a nut. Look at all the carbon parts. You've got a spacer here. You've got this plate. You've got this plate. You've got that plate. You've got these little guys. Just putting this thing together is going to be more complicated than a simpler frame. And that extends to the need to have spares. This was something that I got my eyes open to while trying to do some repairs during a freestyle shoot with Rotor Riot. I had broken a part and I was like dropping. I had the smooth operator with me, and it's similar to this in that it has a million little fiddly parts. And I was dropping them on the ground and losing them, and I thought, oh my God, a frame like this is going to be a real hassle to maintain in the field simply because of the sheer number of parts it has. And it's also going to be difficult to have spares on hand. The fewer parts there are, the easier it is to have a spare of the part that you happen to break. But in this case, we've got the rear strut here, we've got the arms, we've got arms here, we've got the front strut here, we've got all these different plates. If you wanted to have spares, you'd essentially need to have a whole separate frame. And you're definitely going to want at least like one or two of these struts, because that's definitely what you're going to break in the field if and when something breaks. That's a trade-off that some people are going to be very willing to make. Other people are just going to be like, it's just so not worth it for me. I think Hyperlow have done as good a job as is really possible to make a frame this complicated easy to maintain and easy to build, but it definitely still is more complicated, harder to maintain, and harder to build than some other styles of frames that are much, much simpler. So that brings us to the end of this review, and as always, the final question, should you buy it? This frame comes in at about 80 bucks, and if we compare it to other frames on the market, the Catalyst Machineworks Smooth Operator would definitely appeal to the same kind of person who's looking at this frame. It is more high performance, centralized in weight, also fiddlier, and a little harder to maintain. If we compare the Hyperlow to the Smooth Operator, we see one major difference is that the Smooth Operator is more of a pure X configuration, whereas the Hyperlow is more of a stretched X geometry. And although I said earlier that the flight controller makes most of the difference, the geometry does matter. The pure X geometry of the Smooth Operator is going to give a more neutral freestyle experience and going to do a better job of keeping the props out of view. The other thing to point out about the Smooth Operator is that the front end does a much better job of protecting the camera, although they both have the same problem that when you take those hard front impacts, something breaks, and then with the Smooth Operator, the whole freaking front end has to fall apart in your hands in order to fix anything, and that's a little bit of annoyance. It's all annoying. So between the Smooth Operator and the Hyperlow Vert Free V2, I think I would lean towards the Hyperlow for its slightly easier maintenance and easier build, even though its geometry is not quite as optimal for freestyle. It's also lower priced. But the real question to me is how it compares to something like the Armatan Chameleon TI or the Armatan Marmot. And I really think these two frames are just going to appeal to a completely different style of pilot. Because if you look at this and you go, oh, yes, then you probably look at this and you go, look how heavy and, you know, it's just not for you. And if you look at this and you go, yes, then you look at this and you go, yeah, why would I? Yeah. And so at the end of the day, that's what I say about this review. If you want a centralized weight, sort of fiddly, maybe not too difficult, but not exactly easy to repair frame with a lot of spares you need to keep on hand for when they break, Hyperlow Vert Free V2. I'm really excited to fly it. I think Hyperlow has done a hell of a job on this. I'm always happy to share frames with new ideas or new ways of putting together old ideas, and this is definitely one of them. Taking this style of frame design and trying to fix some of the things that are wrong with it, like the difficulty of maintenance and these extra TPU plates. Big fan of what Hyperlow has done here. This isn't the perfect frame for every pilot, and certainly not for like a first-time builder, but it is a very nice freestyle frame for somebody out there. This is going to be exactly what they're looking for. Let me know your experience. Have you flown this frame or one of the other? Hyperlow actually has a whole line of frames with interesting little ideas like this. This is the Vert V2. I actually kind of thought they were sending me the Hyperlow CG, which is a little bit more of a traditional, but this is actually their newer design. So let me know what your experience has been with these Hyperlows. Looking forward to showing you guys Betaflight 4.0 PID tuning using this very quad. And that's going to do it. Oh, link in the video description. Link in the video description if you want to pick up this frame. Thank you guys so much for watching. Happy flying.